Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream, where we cover all of the pressing issues facing America, facing your state. And this week, there is no more important topic than what seems to be in every news cycle, and that is this concept of critical race theory, which manifests itself in so many respects. We see it here in Texas in reference to certain bills that would actually tighten the election code. There are woke corporations trying to implement critical race theory as they push back baselessly on that legislation. In your state, you see something similar. And as we will hear today from our two guests, both of whom are great patriots, it obviously is a big issue facing us at the federal level. And so, as we usually do every Monday, we're going to dissect that issue for you. We're going to take your questions and hopefully give all of us, starting with the three of us on today's show, some action items about what we can do to help fix it. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, your host, and I am joined by two great friends. Chris Rufo, you probably have seen his work in written form as a contributing editor to City Journal. And equally importantly, you've probably seen his work in film form. He is one of the great documentarians of our era, and you will hear what he's learned about critical race theory and associated topics in today's conversation. We're also joined by Wade Miller, who is the executive director for the Center for Renewing America, a 501c4, relatively new, paired with our other friend, Russ Vogt, who is also great on this topic, as y'all know. And together, Chris and Wade will diagnose the problem and also provide some solutions. So to Chris and Wade, thanks for joining us. Let me say, Chris Rufo, we're going to start with you to give us the proverbial 30,000-foot view of what's going on with this problem.
Sure. So critical race theory is an academic discipline that argues that the United States is a fundamentally racist country and that all American institutions, including the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, our legal system, they preach the ideas of freedom and equality, but actually in reality, under the surface of those claims, maintain a system of white supremacy, patriarchy, and racist domination. That's the core claim of this academic theory. And what we've seen in the last few years is that it's moved out of academia at places like Harvard Law School and UCLA and Stanford and into public policy. And you'll hear a lot of rhetoric about any kind of racial disparity is a de facto admission of discrimination or racism. And the critical race theorists are trying now to move their ideas into the implementation phase. So you'll get things in a wide variety of ways. So, for example, Vermont, the state of Vermont just opened up COVID vaccines to people under the age of 50 only if they were people of color. So barring medical services from white Vermonters and only providing it to certain designated racial groups. That's an idea of critical race theorist policy. But more than anything, what we're seeing is that the critical race theorists are attacking public institutions at the state and federal level, but also in education. So they're trying to reform the state curricula to push their ideas. I can talk a little bit more later about what that means in practicality, but what they're doing is basically taking the old Marxist idea of the oppressor and the oppressed. In Marx's time, it was the bourgeoisie or the capitalists and the proletariat or the workers. And they're saying that doesn't really apply to the United States that has a large middle class. Marxist ideas have never taken root. So we're going to change it to a racial dialectic. Instead of the capitalists and the workers, we're going to say black and white, because the critical theorists and the critical race theorists believe that that was the best entry point in American society, that they could gain a foothold in the institutions and then start propagating their ideas as public policy.
There's a lot there to chew on, Chris. You've been in the front lines of it, so we'll come back and follow up with some detail there. Wade, I want to ask you, because of the work that you're currently doing at the Center for Renewing America, but just in case our audience doesn't know, you're just finished a stint as chief of staff to our great friend and also a wonderful leader on this issue, Congressman Chip Roy. You're also a combat veteran, a U.S. Marine. And so you've got some aspects of analyzing this on what I like to call the sidewalk level, whether it be the military or the halls of Congress. Why don't you give us your high-level assessment, and then the three of us will walk through some more specific details, sort of flesh out the problem.
Sure, thanks. It's a great question. So I was actively involved in campaign operations in the 2018 cycle and then the 2020 cycle. And I'll tell you, I saw a huge difference in the kind of the everyman on the street attitude about political engagement from 2018 to just 2020. I ran into donors, activists who were increasingly worried about getting involved in anything political because they were being worried about being canceled. Now, we can do a whole panel on cancel culture and all that, but I think the important thing to note is kind of the thing that's the foundation for all of this wokeism is this 30-year-old, and really it goes beyond that. I mean, we're talking about, Chris was talking about Marxism before that, but this academic concept that's about 3-4 decades old that has kind of led us to a place that's corporations are engaging. They're worried about how they're viewed in the public square by the left, by the media. And so they're all engaging in this same synergy and the same direction that's leading to, people having to get trainings and corporations developing their own internal equity scores because they want to get ahead of the groups that are trying to form up national scores. And all of this leads into direction of oppressor versus oppressed, dividing us, setting us off as different groups, making aspersions about people just because of their immutable traits of their skin color, of their sex. And people are really worried. They're worried about losing their businesses. They're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about being doxxed. And this is the kind of the intellectual heft that's making it morally okay, and as they would see it, to do that, because we are perpetuating an evil system, and it's okay to treat people like this because they support that quote unquote evil system. And I've talked to a lot of my friends who are veterans, some of them active duty, and so they have to be careful what they say, especially publicly. And they're getting these trainings, and they're talking about how morale is low, and they think that there's no need for most of this, and that ultimately what's happening is the rank and file of the military is just fine. They think that everything is going mostly smoothly. There's always going to be inappropriate conduct here and there, and it should be punished. But what they see is they see kind of like generals and colonels trying to get their next promotion. So they're using this as a political tool to make themselves politically acceptable before Congress to get their next promotion to 2 or 3 stars approved. And it's kind of at the basically for their own benefit, but against the interests of the common rank and file who should be focusing on their mission at hand. But they're getting more and more of these trainings, all-day trainings, and they're being categorized in different groups and pitted against one another. And Chris talked about how old this is, and we can have a whole conversation on the academic nature of critical race theory. But my bigger concern is, and as all of you know, and anyone who studied education standards and all of the standards that go into what should be taught in the classroom, it's what these thousands of individuals who are taking these standards, what they're actually saying. So they're going beyond, there's a little bit of a defense and a debate that we can have on the merits of this, and I'm still opposed. But it goes way beyond that when you get in front of people and you get these activists that are teaching this, and they go way beyond the scope of what publicly is even acknowledged as critical race theory. And that's even worse.
No, it is. Both of you have given our audience a lot to think about in terms of examples of where critical race theory has manifest in modern society. Just a brief personal aside, you two of you, I think, know I'm a historian of race in America, and was trained at a place that's pretty left of center. And even though I was an outspoken conservative and clearly white, I was allowed to do that, a verb purposely chosen. There is no way in the world with critical race theory that people who are interested in studying history or political science that might have some aspect, something to do with race and ethnicity could get away with that, because it would be heterodox. I mean, it's sort of a religion to these folks. The main point I'm trying to convey, though, is 20-something years ago when I was doing that, I thought it was just going to stay in the halls of academia, like a lot of other crazy theories, right? And one of the big objectives we have in having this conversation for our audience today is to prove to you in the audience that this is not something that is a theory. It is not something that 3 conservative guys have just decided that we're going to talk about. This is already changing the way people are living in the United States in ways that are really unacceptable. So let me just ask the proverbial devil's advocate question, to be fair, because we have some folks tuning in who've heard about this and might very reasonably say, well, isn't this just how America comes to grips with its racist past? Isn't it just making sure that we're being fair? Chris, why don't you take the first bite at that question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really the rhetorical strategy that they use to try to persuade you to accept their conclusions. But I would say conservatives need to be very calm and considered. What they need to do is separate the premise from the conclusion. The premise is true. I mean, there is a history of racism, of slavery, of discrimination in the United States. That's a fact that I think anyone that looks at history can accept. But just because you accept that as a factual historical matter doesn't mean you have to accept the conclusions of the critical race theorists. And what the critical race theorists want is something very clear. You look at Cheryl Harris, the former Harvard law professor and founder of critical race theory. She recommended in a foundational paper called Whiteness as Property that what really needs to happen is that private property rights in the United States need to be suspended. The government should seize land and wealth from white individuals and then transfer it along racial lines to the oppressed. This is the kind of basic formula of land reform that you see in post-colonial African societies. She says that's a good model to follow. Or Ibram Kendi, the new critical race guru, who suggests that we should create a department of anti-racism, a fourth branch of government that is not accountable to the executive, not accountable to the Congress, and not accountable to the courts, that would have the power to abolish, veto, or nullify any law at any level of government in the United States. It would also have the power to censor speech from policymakers and academics and journalists if that speech was not deemed anti-racist. So very quickly, when you get, what do the critical race theorists want? You get the suspension of private property, the suspension of First Amendment rights, the suspension of our system of constitutional checks and balances and three branches of government, as well as the suspension of the 14th Amendment right to equal protection. So you can basically say there are ways that we need to address historical racism, residual impacts of that historical process without adopting the solutions of critical race theorists. But really quickly, I'd like to give people a sense of what does critical race theory mean in practice? And I've just completed a 12-part investigative reporting series on critical race theory in schools. And this will show you exactly what to expect if critical race theory comes to your school district, comes to your state curriculum. I'll give a few brief examples. In Cupertino, California, they're taking first grade students, so 4 and 5-year-olds, 5 and 6-year-olds rather, and they're forcing them to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and then rank themselves according to their power and privilege. So they're separating first graders into oppressor and oppressed based on their race, sex, and other characteristics. In Buffalo, the public schools are teaching, quote, that all white people perpetuate systemic racism. They're also showing kindergartners a dramatization video of dead Black children that are warning these kindergartners that, quote, racist police could kill them at any moment. And that white Americans derive their wealth from slavery and that they are, quote, unfairly rich. Or in Springfield, Missouri, not exactly a liberal state, they took middle school teachers during a training session and they forced them to identify themselves on an oppression matrix. And they separated white, heterosexual, English-speaking male teachers. They said that you are the oppressors. And then people of color, women, sexual and religious minorities, you are the oppressed. Despite the fact that you're not taking into anyone's account their personal history. And then for one last example that I think is absolutely egregious, a public school in New York City sent an email directed to white parents and said that white parents at this public school need to become, quote, white traitors and advocate for, quote, white abolition. The language of this is so shocking. It verges, if it were applied to any other racial group, it would verge almost on the kind of rhetoric of destruction that you would reject wholeheartedly. But I think it's the natural consequence of critical race theory once it takes impact in institutions.
Well, and I think it's crucial for the sake of argumentation in the work that the three of us do and that our audience is interested in, that we have those kinds of examples at the ready, Chris. So I'm really grateful for that. And it reminds me of the question that people often ask me, and that is, well, aren't our schools in a relatively conservative state like Texas okay? Or insert your state that you think is relatively conservative or your town. And the answer is no. And I'm not saying that trying to exaggerate the threat. This is something that's truly insidious, and the pace at which it has really taken over many school districts and state boards of education is alarming. I think I can probably speak for the two of you. So Wade, to come back to you in a different arena, and that's the arena in which you reside and work, and that's the federal policy area for the most part. Give us a sense of the threats that you see there, whether it be in Congress itself, maybe through certain rules under the regime in power now, but also I know you've done some work on how this is being implemented in corporations.
Sure. So currently, for those who aren't aware, Russ Vogt, who is the former director of Office and Management and Budget, was able to get this critical race theory banned across the entire spectrum of the federal government. And of course, one of the first things that President Biden did when he came into office was to reverse course on that to make it not banned. So of course, all of the taxpayer dollars that are going towards these trainings will pick back up. And these trainings are all over the place, every agency, every branch of government. In fact, Chris mentioned Kendi. That book written by Kendi is now on the Navy's official reading list, and so it's permeating back out into the military, all over the federal government. And that's why we're working currently with Senator Tom Cotton. He's got a bill to ban CRT in the military. We're working with other members of Congress to work on this at the federal level again, and then. You mentioned, you talk about corporations, and this is a little trickier. We have to take a hard look at this and say, how do we get involved? What's the appropriate level of government? What's the appropriate action to get involved in this sphere at the corporate level? That's a debatable conversation that we should have. But at the very least, I think that there's a robust action that people need to take, and we need to start identifying where this is at. And frankly, I'm hoping that governors will stand united in pushing back on some of the corporations that are starting to band together to force through their radical agenda to the degree that they're able to do it as well. But really, it's awareness. People need to be aware of what's going on, and then understand, what the root cause, a lot of which we've talked about here. But it's even manifesting itself in action civics. We've talked about for decades as conservatives and those of us who are right of center about the need for civics to be taught again, so that we can be producing an electorate that understands the system they have, cherishes it, but also wants to continue to improve upon it. And getting back to the conversation that you all just had about our history, and of course we're not perfect. Of course, bad things have happened by our government at the hands of those in power. But there's a difference between the left and the right. That we want to identify it, talk about it, so we can learn from it and move forward and love our country in the process because it's trying to become better. Whereas the whole premise of the left in all of this is to identify what we've done wrong and then use that as a sounding board to make the argument that we are systemically evil. And therefore, there's nothing redeemable about this country. We have to remake it from the ground up. And that leads to things like action civics. The left's taking a page out of our playbook and pushing for quote unquote civics, but it actually isn't civics. It's basically a curriculum that just teaches people how to be activists, or students how to be activists. It doesn't teach what's great about this country, how it works, and how we can work within that system and make this country better. It's just basically training leftist activists. And it's no surprise that these people go on to universities where, of course, it's even more formally instructed, and then they go into corporations and they're making their way up to middle and senior management, and some of them are even CEOs. And so we're seeing it manifest itself in a coordinated effort by the left that's now increasingly controlling some of the corporate America. And then they're colluding with the media, who's of course pushing this talking point. They're colluding with academia, which is 100% on board with this. And then they're colluding with those in government power, which unfortunately right now at the federal level is Democrat controlled. And so that's a powerful 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, combination punch there, for which we've got to find a way to counter. And that's what we're working to do by shining a light on it. And one of the common refrains I get from people who just don't understand what critical race theory is they can't understand why we would oppose teaching that racism is wrong, or why we would oppose teaching that sexism is wrong. And that's not what CRT is. That it's completely appropriate, whether in the military or corporate America, to have ethical trainings with and understanding with employees what is permissible conduct in the workplace. And certainly being racist is a fireable offense. It's a court-martialable offense if you're in the military. Same goes with sexism. We can teach what is professional appropriate conduct, and in a way that in no way, shape, or form includes critical race theory. And unfortunately, I think corporations are pandering to the woke mob right now in order to be the last ones eaten. And I think that they think that they'll survive this, but they won't. They're just basically helping along an ideology of Marxism, which its ultimate aim, as Chris alluded to, is to destroy capitalism. It's to destroy free markets. It's to implement socialism. And they're going to do this through, cultural Marxism over time.
Yeah, they will. That is the underlying philosophy, as both of you pointed out well. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions, gentlemen. So if you're in the audience, you have a question you have not posed yet, now would be the time to do that. We'll get to as many of them as possible. And Chris, I'm going to pitch this question to you. We've talked about kind of high level defining what critical race theory is. Both of you have done an exceptional job of explaining some examples of where this is happening, how it's happening. What are some solutions, whether at the federal level or that certain state legislatures have taken up?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at education, for example, I think the solution is pretty simple. It's to reiterate the values and principles in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and to say that public schools and public institutions should not promote race essentialism, which teaches that you can judge someone solely on the basis of race. Public schools and public institutions should not teach collective guilt, meaning that if you share skin color or racial origin or sex or gender with someone else, that you are guilty for their sins as well. And third, and this is honestly astonishing that I even have to say this, but public institutions should not practice neo-segregation. You see universities, public schools, even federal agencies now that are separating employees on the basis of race. They're providing one training session or facility for people of color, another one for a training session or facility for white employees. This was wrong in 1955. It's definitely wrong in 2021. We should have no hesitation in standing against this. And when you put those things together, collective guilt, race essentialism, and neo-segregation, we should draw a hard line. These are principles and practices that we do not tolerate, and legislators have a responsibility to basically say you cannot promote or teach these ideas in the classroom. You can teach them contextually, right? This is the big argument that they make. Well, they say, well, you're impinging on freedom of speech. No, you're basically reiterating the simple values of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You can't harass people on the basis of race. You can't discriminate against people on the basis of race. Whether it comes, frankly, from the left or the right, it's always wrong. And legislators should take ownership, because there's even on some of our friends, they have a hesitation to use the power of government to craft a curriculum or to craft government policy. But they should remember, legislators, or across the country, even federal legislators, they should remember that they have a responsibility to create a school curricula that promotes the values of this country, of their state, and reflects the values of their constituents. So they should have no hesitation in saying there are certain things that we can teach as contextual matters. There are certain things you can teach without endorsing them, but you cannot promote race essentialism. You cannot promote collective guilt, and you cannot segregate students or employees on the basis of race.
Yeah.
So this one's. Oh, go ahead.
Wade.
Well, I was going to say this one's pretty easy when it comes to government. You can just ban it. I think that the debate where we're having, and I've been reading some interesting legal arguments. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I've been diving into it. Is how does this affect? As Chris was saying, hiring practices. What are those? What is the basis for being hired or not hired? Looking at some of the civil rights implications of those arguments, and then taking a look and seeing, how can we, put a stop to that type of race essentialism. We're seeing corporations put out these reports on where they're going to be in 10 years to satisfy some of the, social justice crowd. And they're going to have an exact percentage of these people hired, an exact percentage of these other people hired of either this race or this sex or this, sexual identity. And I think that that's going about it, in the exact wrong way. I think that that's promoting immutable traits in large part as a means for hiring. And I don't think that's the way we should go. That isn't to say that we can't take, holistic look at hiring practices. For instance, if you've got a 3.8, you have one parent, that works 3 different jobs, and you're going up against a student who had a 4.0, who had two parents who were upper income, who had tutors and all the opportunities in the world, I think it's perfectly rational for someone in an employer that's employing someone, that's interviewing someone, to take a look at that and make a decision about who the better of the two candidates are based on their work ethic and the opportunities they've had before them, and then therefore what will that portend for the type of product that they'll provide when they're working for us. That's completely fine, but that's not where this is going at all. And the one question I would have for some of these corporations who are saying, for instance, by 2030 we'll hit these goals. Well, why not this year? I think we should start turning the question on. The point is they actually don't want to do it right away. But if it's in their view socially wrong and immoral, then my question would be, why a 10-year timeline? Why does it take a corporation 10 years to do what they think is morally justifiable? I think we should put them in the hot seat and demand that they do it even quicker, or explain why that is or isn't. And the real reason is they can't meet these quotas because not everyone wants to go learn computer science. I can barely manage to turn on this iPad. I'm certainly not a computer genius. I can't go get a job at Dell or Microsoft. And we can't, they're just not coming out of colleges in these exact cookie cutter percentages that these corporations would want. And that's another question about, opportunity. And we can talk about education systems and curriculum and how can we encourage people to get into certain fields, and that's fine. But basically what these corporations are doing is they're overtly saying that we're not going to hire based on person who is most qualified. We're going to hire a person because of immutable traits. And critical race theory is the basis for all of this that's happening. And it's sad to see.
Well, it certainly is, Wade. Gentlemen, we're going to move on to some audience questions. And the first one, Wade, I'm going to pitch to you because it's an excellent follow-up to what you were just talking about regarding corporations. And this is the first time this audience member has heard about corporate social equity scores. And they're asking what it is, how widespread it is. Why don't you take that one?
Sure. So there's a movement afoot to basically create, and most of this is being done by leftist organizations, to create a national standard by which to score corporations based on how basically woke they are. What percentage of their energy is coming from, renewable clean energy, how many of their board of directors are female versus male, or black versus white, or Asian versus Hispanic. And it goes on and on and on. In every single field of leftist wokeism, they will be scored on these metrics. So you're seeing increasingly all of these corporations come out with their own scores. I think most of it's because they know that they can't meet the timeline that the woke leftist would like. And so they're basically trying to put the anchor out there and say that we'll hit it by 2030, which is, gives them 10 years to figure out, how do we fill up, 75% of these jobs in which we can't find anyone coming out of college who wants to apply for. And so this is a big problem. I mean, if you had told me 5 years ago that the United States would be heading in the direction of what China's doing, which is basically social equity, a score, and citizens have social equity scores, corporations are already moving in that direction. And it's before long, they're going to be pushing that for people seeking employment. I mean, in China, you have to hold a phone up and look at it. It has to have facial ID to even let you into the internet. And then it will score you on your behavior and how, all these things you're doing, whether or not you're a good citizen or not. I mean, it's only a matter of time. And people think that's silly and a slippery slope. And I certainly hope it's insane and crazy and will never happen in the United States. But I can't say that it's not going to happen because of all of these pushes to have all of these social equity scores. And there's different names for it, for that type of thing. But that's the direction we're going. That's certainly what the left would want. They don't want anyone to be able to get a job if you happen to be right of center or support the wrong candidate or don't buy into critical race theory or don't buy into action civics or won't identify that there's more than two genders or whatever the cause is of the day. They don't want you to be able to get a job, and they will continue to push for this. Now, I hope our culture and our society are resilient enough to push back against those efforts and to make sure that never comes to fruition. But I'm actually genuinely concerned that within the next decade, and certainly within the next 2 decades, that's something that will be a reality in the United States, unfortunately.
Yeah, it unfortunately will, unless we are able to galvanize some folks to push back on it. And it's in that spirit, Chris, that we have two different audience members asking related questions. So I'll roll them into one for you. And it's about school districts. One of the questions is, what can we do when our school district is hiring a company that promotes a CRT curriculum? And secondly, very related, what can school board members do to combat critical race theory?
Yeah, good question. I mean, schools is truly, I think, the most important battleground, but in a note of optimism is also a battleground that conservative citizens and parents, and even frankly, center-left citizens and parents are starting to identify and starting to push back against. And I've reported on a number of stories of parents in Virginia and California who have successfully fought back against some of the worst excesses of critical race theory in schools. This is, in many cases, a broad multiracial coalition of parents because they're learning that CRT eventually will come for them too, and they have to stand up on principle. I reported, for example, a number of stories from California where Asian American parents have banded together to fight critical race theory in schools because under critical race theory, Asian Americans are often considered oppressors because of their high levels of education. And one family told me, said, hey, look, I grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution. I understand what happens when ideologues seize public institutions to push divisive, cultural, Marxist policies. It didn't work very well in my home country of China, and I'm astonished and appalled that it's happening here in the United States with the kind of similar style of rhetoric. And the advice that I would give is really twofold. One is get educated. There's a number of books and articles and essays and examples from me and from others that can give you a sense of what's happening, what language to use, what to say to fight back. But second, and most importantly, is to get organized. It's very easy for a school district or a principal or school board to dismiss one person, to say, well, we're not going to listen to you. But if you have 5 people or 10 people or 20 or 100 people that are pushing back together, all of a sudden they can't dismiss you, they can't smear you, and they can't silence you because you've developed enough of a critical mass. I'd also recommend reaching out to 2 organizations. I serve on the advisory board for both of them. I can vouch for both of them. One is called FAIR, F-A-I-R, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. It's a center-left organization, but they're uniting with people across the political spectrum to fight back against this stuff. Reach out to them. The other one is Parents Defending Education. This is another grassroots group that provides parents with resources and materials to push back. And in the end of the day, we're on the right side. We're protecting the values and principles of this country that have led to enormous progress, including on racial issues. And you should fight back with a spirit of courage, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take, we see a lot of cowardice from the C-suite and many corporations, from a lot of leaders in our country who should be standing up. So the people, the actual citizens of the United States, need to exemplify and demonstrate and practice that courage. Because once enough of us stand up, draw that line in the sand and push back, showing that spirit of courage, we're going to have a cascade of effects and finally stop this onslaught before it does damage to our institutions and to our kids.
It is, and just to underscore that last point you make, Chris, the pace of this is accelerating. And so if you're sitting in the audience and asking that question, we hope we have inspired, which is, what can I do to help reverse this trend? It would be starting with your school district as an example. Maybe you have friends who are business leaders, is giving them information to sort of steel their resolve to fight this. And it's in that spirit, guys, that I'll pose the last question from the audience before the real final question, which comes from me about your optimism. And this question from the audience, I'd like for each of you to take. We'll start with you, Wade. This audience member asks, what's a good alternative to critical race theory for informing individuals about racial issues that are still present?
Sure. So I think that a question like that, Chris might be able to better answer a specific program. But honestly, I just think that standard civics. I mean, when I went through school, we used to learn about slavery, and we used to learn about Jim Crow, and we used to learn about all of these bad FDR, and then the Asian Americans being put in camps during World War II. We used to learn about all of that, but it was always under the guise of this country's moving forward, that there was an idea at the beginning of this country that we were struggling to always improve and meet, and we may never ultimately realize the perfect vision of that idea, but we should always try to get closer. And we learned about the bad of this country, but we learned about it in the vein of people coming together to end that. These were Americans that came together to end that. And so I would say a good start would simply be going back to learning history and civics the way we used to learn it 30, 40 years ago. Of course, that's way out the window. And that starts with getting involved to make sure that all of your school curriculum and standards are in place. But as we all know, you can have great standards and great curriculum guidelines, and you can have teachers that just ignore them in the classroom. I mean, I remember when I was in 6th grade, my social studies teacher, and this might date me a little bit, but he said that the Soviet Union would outlast the United States. He said that in front of the entire class. I'll never forget this. I was in 6th grade or maybe 7th grade. I remember thinking how absolutely insane that was. And of course, a few years later, that ultimately proved wrong. But you can have teachers that are just completely ignoring all of these important standards. And I know that, Heritage and a lot of other groups are working hard. Lindsay Burke, I just watched a panel that she was on, and she went into this in great detail and what was important. But it starts with parents being involved. What is your teacher teaching? What your child, and what materials are they using? And are they adhering to the standards? And so I think that's, the first step. If there's a more formal program, like I know Hillsdale has some really good programs, then I may not be aware of it. But if Chris wants to maybe take it from there and pick up and see if he has any good recommendations.
Yeah, great start, Wade. Chris, why don't you pick up from there?
Yeah, I think that's right. And listen, you don't want to have a propaganda version of American history from the right or from the left. You don't want to have a doom and gloom version. You don't want to have a Pollyanna version. You want to assume that students are sophisticated. They can grapple with a multifaceted story, and you can tell the story of America, I think, in the most truthful way possible, to acknowledge the historical injustices and even evils, but also acknowledge that the country was founded on this idea, imperfectly practiced at the time, that all men were created equal. Americans consecrated that idea in blood on the battlefields of the Civil War. And then Americans codified it into law in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Act. And I think you can acknowledge historical injustice because we live in a tragic and imperfect world, while also acknowledging that the United States has done more to advance these causes towards freedom and equality than any country in the history of the world. And ultimately, I think I'm optimistic about America, and that public institutions should also have an optimistic spirit about the public that is supporting them, that is entrusting them with their kids, and that is requiring of them to teach something that is truly valuable, that gives kids a sense of agency, a sense of purpose, a sense of possibility, and a sense that despite the flaws, this is a country that can continue always to improve. And there are a number of curricula that I think are being developed right now. If you look at the 1776 Unites project, it's a group of predominantly Black scholars that have prepared a kind of rebuttal to the 1619 project. The National Association of Scholars is now working on another curriculum that provides a more balanced look. And I think there are really two strategies we have to pursue simultaneously. One is a simple declarative ban, basically saying, hey, public schools cannot teach that you can judge people on the basis of race. Public schools cannot teach that because of your race, you are by nature an oppressor or an oppressed person. They also can't teach that the United States is a fundamentally evil country. These should be very basic standards that do not apply, should not be promoted in public institutions. But I think there's another thing that is essential. A bigger strategic picture is that we have to give kids, especially kids in the poorest neighborhoods and kids that are trapped in the worst public schools, we have to give them a right to exit. Every student, regardless of family background, regardless of family income, deserves a great education, deserves an education that reflects the values of those families. And I think school choice is really essential, especially as activists start hijacking public institutions to push their private ideologies. The school choice movement is even more essential today than it was last year or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I'm convinced that if we want to fulfill the potential of every student, and every young person in this country. We have to give them a right to exit systems that are failing, both on an ideological level and on a practical level, for preparing them for the world.
Amen, brother. And, having been involved in the school choice movement for 20 years, I've never seen it have more momentum than it does now, because the very challenging experiences of the last year, 15 months have proven that the systems that we've spent literally trillions of dollars on in the last 30 years are not serving kids well. And at the very least, as you say, children, their families ought to have the right to exit. So, gentlemen, I could talk to y'all all afternoon, and I know our audience members would enjoy that, but y'all have important work to do. And so I want to ask you a final question that I try to ask all of our guests. And Wade, we'll start with you. And that is, in spite of all of the challenges we've experienced, in spite of the challenge we're talking about today, critical race theory, why did you wake up this morning optimistic about the future of America?
That's a great question, because increasingly I'm seeing people getting educated about this and they're getting passionate about it. Even people who don't have children, whose children are grown up and through school and not worried about it infecting their mind anymore, because they're seeing it as a national security threat. I mean, let me tell you this: who loves critical race theory even more than the left? China. I've been watching the Chinese state-owned media. They love sitting back and watching this divide our society. They've been promoting it. They're paid mouthpieces. You can even see on Twitter that China state media, disclaimer, they're pushing this because they see it dividing us. But I think Americans are waking up. I think centrists are starting to see that this is way too far to the left and that this is not appropriate. This is not, as President Biden said, he wants to unite the country, that this in no way, shape, or form would achieve that. It's just further dividing us. And so I think people just being educated and understanding what critical race theory is and isn't, because that's a big part of the education curve, is what is it? And people still don't quite know. They think they have a sense that it's bad. But I think as entities like PPPF have panels like this and kind of help spread the word on what it is, the polling on this is not good if you define it properly. And so I'm pretty optimistic that as we continue to get the word out, we're going to have success at state legislatures getting bans on this put in place in a number of states. And a lot of states haven't even started meeting yet. So we've got even more time to prepare those state legislatures to push back on this. And as states begin to do that, I think that there will be safety in numbers. A lot of people are worried. A lot of governors are worried. A lot of elected officials are worried that if they start doing this, they're going to be labeled as racist or whatever the left is going to throw at us. And I think that on this one, people just need to stand up, defend our culture, defend what is right and wrong, defend the moral high ground here, which is to ensure that everyone in our country is treated fairly and equally, and that we're not divided, we're not cast aside just simply because of the color of our skin or simply because of the gender that we were born. And so I'm pretty optimistic. I see the writing on the wall. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have other challenges, but I think that we've got good forward momentum on critical race theory.
Yeah, well said, Wade. Thanks so much for joining us. Chris, why did you wake up this morning optimistic about the future of America?
Well, I'll tell you exactly why. And I do, in my investigative reporting, I've talked to a lot of people about critical race theory, a lot of average families. And in particular, I've talked to a lot of immigrants from former communist regimes and also theocratic regimes. And their words have inspired me, and I think should remind us all of the great promise of the United States and of our country. I had a woman from Iran who said, I grew up under the theocratic regime in Iran. When I would show up to school, I would chant "Death to America" every day before entering the classroom. And I'm seeing the same kind of attitude and rhetoric being taught in public schools in Portland, Oregon. And I'm absolutely horrified. This is an incredible country. We have all these rights and freedoms and opportunities. We have to fight back. I spoke to someone from the former Soviet Union who said, I grew up being pumped with propaganda by the Soviets, and I'm worried that my kids are being pumped with left-wing propaganda in American schools. I never thought it would happen, but I'm going to start fighting back. And as I mentioned, I've talked with people from communist China who said, in some cases, they lived through a cultural revolution there. They're not going to let it happen here. And I think that we have to listen to those voices who have seen the worst human devastation from Marxist ideologies all around the world. We have to take their testimony to heart. We have to remember that they have experienced what could happen at stage 10, and then have the prudence and presence of mind to take action now at stage 1. And to say that, in the 20th century, the United States defeated Marxism abroad. In the 21st century, we're not going to let Marxism take hold here at home. And I know we can do it. I know that Americans, we're kind of people who sometimes show up late. We kind of wait back and things get kind of sideways and they don't go so well. But we always show up in full force. We always win. And we always fight for those principles that have inspired people from all over the world to come to this country, including my own family. And that always gives me hope. And I think that this is, hopefully, if we take action now, can be a blip in our history, a success that we've stopped from taking too much hold. And I'm optimistic. And it really starts with these great state legislatures who need to show courage and take action at this early time.
That is exactly right. And Chris, thank you for joining us. As I like to tell folks, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And what American history proves is that every time it seems that we've shown up too late, heck, we showed up kind of late to our own American Revolution, that we finally get organized, we finally get galvanized, and there are always, without fail in American history, always, without exception, enough people to stand up to crazy ideas and put them to rest. And I'll relate one final story before we wrap, gentlemen, because our audience has heard me answer my own question plenty. And that is, on Saturday in suburban Austin, I was at an outdoor music recital for middle school and high school kids for one of my daughters. And one of the other musicians was the son of a Nigerian immigrant. And when he got up to play his song on his guitar, it was the Star Spangled Banner. And there were two things about that, I'd get chills just thinking about it, that struck me. The first is when he started playing very softly, very well, I should say too, very quietly, this audience of a few hundred people stopped checking their phones. They stopped murmuring to one another, and they paid really close attention. And if you'd happened upon that gathering just a few minutes prior, there was typical American audience. We're distracted. We like talking to one another. We love our screens. But the second thing that struck me was that his dad, immigrant from Nigeria, was filming on his phone. And think of how many thousands of people in Nigeria have seen that video, that dad, that immigrant beaming with pride about this country. And it's that kind of story that makes me optimistic. I think about the work we do in the Texas legislature, the work the two of you are doing so importantly all around this country. And if you're in the audience today and you're feeling kind of disengaged and disaffected and discouraged, that's what the left wants you to feel. That's what the advocates for critical race theory want you to feel. So just on that basis alone, please reject it, join the fight, and let's go save this country, because Lord knows it's worth saving. God bless you, my friends, for joining me. Thank you and the audience for making time, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.